And now we'll turn it over to Ngo Community, who serves as the Senior Program Specialist at the COPS office.
Thank you, Cameron. On behalf of the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services and the Institute for Intergovernmental Research, we would like to welcome you to today's Prosecuting Labor Trafficking Case Studies webinar. Topics for this webinar will include the collection of evidence and preparing it for testimony, distinguishing between the types of evidence present in a labor trafficking case, and promising practices for successful prosecution of our labor trafficking case. To get us started, I would like to introduce IAR Senior Manager Carolyn Binder, who will facilitate today's webinar. Carolyn?
Thank you so much, Nazmia. Good afternoon, everybody. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this webinar, Detective Megan Bruno-Zentner, Ms. Lori Burke, Ms. Evelyn Chumbau, Attorney Terry Coonan, and Ambassador Louis C. DeBaca. Detective Bruno-Zentner is assigned to the Seattle, Washington Police Department's Criminal Intelligence Unit as a task force officer with Homeland Security Investigations. Her position is funded via the Bureau of Justice Assistance Enhanced Cooperative Model Grant, and her caseload is focused on labor trafficking investigations. Ms. Lori Burke is a consultant in human trafficking to governmental and non-governmental agencies. She is a leading expert on the victim-centered approach in human trafficking cases and collaborative efforts of criminal justice actors and victim care providers with more than 2 decades of experience. She's the founder of Freedom Network USA and a trainer, speaker, and consultant on human trafficking issues, trauma, torture, gender violence, and exploitation in the United States and internationally. Ms. Evelyn Chumbau is a survivor of domestic servitude. She's an advocate with the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking since 2014. She's conducted national presentations on the needs of labor trafficking victims and has been awarded the Presbyterian Peace Seeker Award for her efforts to combat human trafficking. She served as presidential appointee to the United States Human Trafficking Survivor Advisory Council. Attorney Terry Coonan is a professor of law and criminology at Florida State University and founding executive director of FSU's Center for the Advancement of Human Rights, which has done leading work nationwide on human trafficking issues. Attorney Coonan litigates pro bono cases on behalf of trafficking victims throughout Florida and has been a consultant on human trafficking issues with the U.S. Department of Justice, law enforcement officials, and service providers nationwide. Ambassador Louis C. DeBaca is a former diplomat and prosecutor who has served at the U.S. State Department as ambassador at large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, and as the previous director of the U.S. Department of Justice's Office of Sex Offender Monitoring, Apprehending, Registering, and Tracking. Former federal prosecutor in the United States Civil Rights Division, in which he led investigations and prosecutions of dozens of forced labor and sex trafficking cases involving hundreds of victims, as well as guided policy efforts that led to the development of the modern victim-centered approach. Victim protection, such as the T-Visa, the U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and the United States Anti-Trafficking Protocol. I'd like to also welcome Assistant U.S. Attorney and Civil Rights and Human Trafficking Program Manager, and Brandy Donini Melanson, Law Enforcement Program Coordinator for the Executive Office for United States Attorneys, for supporting this event. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Ambassador DeBaca.
Thank you, Karen, and welcome everybody. I wanted to launch us today by kind of starting at the beginning, which is the idea of what it is that we talk about when we're talking about labor trafficking. And so I'm going to be advancing slides here. You know, we're lucky to have not only a lawyer who does these cases as an immigration lawyer and as a victim attorney, but also as a law professor as part of the trainers today. And so I was wondering, Professor Coonan, if you can maybe walk us through the legal definition as far as what is labor trafficking.
Absolutely, Lou. We've had a good definition of labor trafficking. It was established in the Trafficking Victim Protection Act of 2000, and it defines labor trafficking as what we call a segmented crime. It's a number of different sort of violations, any of which can be labor trafficking. It involves the recruitment or the harboring or transportation or providing or obtaining of a person for labor or services using force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjecting that victim, that person, to either involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. Now, what's very important, I think, about that, again, a really varied kind of set of offenses that go into this, any of which can constitute something that's actionable. Any of them are crimes. Again, it's a segmented crime as we would look at it from a legal perspective. Looking beyond that, it's a crime that often hides in plain sight. It is a part of so many of our industries and our services here in the United States. I think in large part maybe because of the globalized nature of services and commodities, but that we've seen it in a host of different locations, different businesses throughout the United States. Those includes agricultural cases, which are literally field slavery cases, construction cases, hospitality cases, oftentimes in our hotels or at times in the places, golf courses, places where people come for recreation. We have seen it also in construction. We have seen a whole new set of cases just in the last year, including religious groups that are offenders. A very important case that was recently prosecuted out in San Diego, the Imperial Valley Ministries case that involved all people that were brought there and were exploited who had a drug issue, a substance abuse. They were supposedly being brought to places where they could be given rehabilitation and instead were exploited. Curiously, it worked on both sides of the border, both in Mexico and in the San Diego El Centro area. We have also seen a number of cases around the country of child labor, door-to-door exploitation, oftentimes of children. But very often it does involve a subcontractor, someone that is working for a larger business who comes in and says, I can provide X or Y services, and I can do it cheaper than other subcontractors here in the United States. It's often the subcontractor who is the actual perpetrator, but as we'll see, and as the law is increasingly recognized, oftentimes it is the corporation or the business that often involves willful blindness, looking in the other direction, not asking, why is that one sort of why is that one bid for labor or for services so much below market value? The other particular crime that we see as part of labor trafficking, it's domestic servitude. And this is one that typically will not involve the subcontractor. It's house slavery. It is pervasive throughout the United States. We have seen as recently as this year convictions for this. In Louisiana, a woman that was cared for supposedly by family when her own guardians died and was instead exploited, held out in the backyard, and not only exploited for domestic servitude, but theft of benefits. Her Social Security benefits were also being stolen from her. So we're seeing a whole host of these cases. We know from our Trafficking in Persons report, it's kind of a report card that our U.S. State Department puts out every year, an evaluation of every country in the world, including our own, in terms of how we're combating trafficking. And what the TIP report has told us once again this year in 2019 is that we have a lot of labor trafficking cases that either haven't been investigated or haven't been prosecuted. A strong reminder for all of us that this is part of our mission here in the United States, that slavery is often hiding in plain sight. Oftentimes it involves invisible chains, coercion, debt servitude, but it is clearly a part of the modern America that we live in, and it involves the exploitation of both U.S. citizens and foreign nationals. So we will look at that today, but important for us to know that we have very good federal statutes, and increasingly now, in the last 10 or 15 years, every state in the country also has human trafficking statutes on their state law books, so that's a new area for us. It's a new frontier. How can we better use our state statutes as well to prosecute these cases?
And Terry, one of the things that, for both of us as law professors and attorneys litigating in court, obviously the four corners of the statutes and this definition that we see up on the slide, are important. But, there is often then, kind of the phenomenon of trafficking. And I wonder, maybe first Flory and then Evelyn, if you can just let us know from your experiences, how does this legal definition actually track with the lived experiences of folks who have been through the human trafficking or modern slavery, as we would call it? Flory?
Hi. I would say that it tracks very closely. The important thing is for people to know that as Terry read this and explained it, that it's not everything included in this definition, that it is a segmented crime. And so in reality, some of these parts will be part of this trafficking story someone reveals. They can talk about how they were transported somewhere, what kind of force was used, if force was used. Most victims don't know the term human trafficking. So if that's used with them early on, you'll get a very kind of puzzled look. What they do know and what they are experts in is what they have experienced. So as we will go into detail later on, that's the key to cases, is finding out what went on and how the victim, survivor, perceived that and experienced it, and that's where we get our information.
And Evelyn, what's your sense when you see a definition like that? How does that actually match up with what you went through and what so many of the friends and colleagues that you work with in the survivor community have gone through?
Thank you. I agree with what all of you have said, especially mostly I do agree with what Flory just mentioned. Again, with this definition and the term, most of us, when we were victims at that time, we did not know that we were victims. As someone like me, coming from Cameroon and not understanding and not knowing that I was going to come to this country and fall victim of, human trafficking. And so for me, I didn't even know that I was a victim when I was in that situation. When I always start off my story, I always say I just thought I was coming to marry Will Smith, So again, a lot of us that come from from another part of the world, when they say, hey, you're coming to the U.S. or to Europe, not once do we think that, hey, we're going to come and be working and not getting paid, or we're going to be abused. Not once do we know that. So the term does, give that, especially when it says domestic, or when it says involuntary servitude. Again, my situation, I'm a survivor of domestic servitude. I did not think that I would be coming to this country at age 9 and taking care of 2 kids, cooking and cleaning, and being forced, and also not being able to go to school. So I do agree with the definition. I also feel that there are other forms of labor trafficking too that a lot of the time we do miss. Like there are people that work in braiding shops that a lot of the times that they, I know survivors that were brought here and forced to work in braiding shops, and they also sleep in those salons and are doing hair, African American hairs, and they're not getting paid. So I don't know how. I think a lot of the time that type of trafficking get missed out as well.
I think that one of the things that we see, and I'm glad you brought up the hair salons, and especially the braiding and twisting, whether it's that, whether it's in nail salons, there are a number of things in the beauty industry where, it is a predominantly immigrant population or a predominantly vulnerable population. One of the things you often hear about, and I've certainly been guilty of this throughout my career as well, is to have people in those situations described as vulnerable and saying, they're totally helpless. And I think that one of the things that I've been struck by, Evelyn, with your work and work of the folks in the survivor community, it really tags what Frederick Douglass said about his situation back before the Civil War. He said, I prayed for freedom for 20 years, but God never answered until I prayed with my feet. And, I think that this idea that the agency and the toughness and the strength the trafficking victims have while they're in that situation, time and again, it's disproven our assumption that these are a bunch of vulnerable victims who are desperate for somebody to come and rescue them, as opposed to the idea that people know what, they might not know that definition. They might not know the concepts and the legal concepts, but they know what's right and they know what's wrong. It may be that we first find out about them because they've become so desperate that they finally made a run for it. But it may be that they haven't tried to escape because they don't think it's a possibility for them at all. I'm going to do a very quick run through of this particular slide, and then we're going to get to, as we get into slide 6 and beyond, I think we're going to really delve into things a little bit more. But this particular slide for our participants, I think it's fairly straightforward as how cases often come up. And I think that the incidents and indicators very much kind of flow into then what we would do with, sorry, I've lost control of my incidents and indicators button there. The things that are up on this slide, whether it's complaints, referrals, raids for other activities, I think a lot of what we have to remember is that if you, in your offices, whether it's a U.S. Attorney's Office, whether it's an FBI or an ICE office, whether it's a local sheriff, whether it's local prosecutors or community serving and community-based organizations, if you think about where these incidents might present themselves, and make sure that you have relationships with each other. Make sure that you know who the regulatory inspectors are. Texas Alcohol Beverage Commission has been invaluable in going in not just to bars and restaurants, but into strip clubs, into cantinas where people are being held in labor trafficking. And they really can be the eyes and ears. So too, if you look at the bottom here, you see the tips from the public, including the hotline. That hotline, they'll be calling you, hopefully. But in case you need it, the hotline number is 1-888-373-7888. That's 1-888-373-7888. And with everything, I think it comes down to being proactive. Working with the NGOs, working with attorneys in specializations that might have clients that are victims, and then educate the public on indicators of labor trafficking. If they trust you and the victims find them, they'll bring them to you, and then you can walk together on their journey to freedom. And I think the best thing that we've seen in the last years is to making that a reality is this multidisciplinary approach that has been brought forward. And I wanted to tee that up and then hand it off to some of my fellow panelists. But I think maybe one of the ways to think about a multidisciplinary approach, and none of us that went into law enforcement probably put this highest on our skill set, but the multidisciplinary approach is about sharing power or even giving up power and recognizing that there are other entities, whether it's community organizations, the church, and others that are listed on this slide, who we need to be working with together. And we work better as a we than we do as an I. Flori, if I can maybe toss it over to you for a little bit more thoughts on the multidisciplinary approach.
Sure. In 2002, in New York City, we started the first multidisciplinary team, and that was funded by a 3-year governmental grant. And the first year was spent mainly just learning to talk to one another, because if you, as we go through this and you see the list of players that we're suggesting be part of your team, we weren't all used to working together. We had to build up trust. We had to understand how the relatively new trafficking law was being implemented, what we were seeing with these cases that were coming in at a rapid rate, in New York anyway. And it turned out to be a great model, and it actually became the model for future funding for the task forces that are funded out of Department of Justice. So I can't say enough about the value of having a team that's cohesive and trusting. And there are lots of models, and there are lots of resources at DOJ through the Office for Victims of Crime. There's an e-guide for task forces that I think are really important, because some people think just put anybody and everybody on a task force and it becomes a huge unwieldy group. And that's not really the most efficient way to share cases and get the work done.
Before it looks like, I know that we have that, the e-guide is actually up on the screen, hopefully for everybody, has additional resources. So the website for that e-guide is available, I think, to everybody. It's certainly on my screen. I hope it's on others people's as well.
Okay. I think a critical point in looking at this multidisciplinary approach is that we move out of our silos a bit, and we realize that, you know, I come from the NGO world, and I had to realize what role immigration played, what role the police played, what role the U.S. Attorney's offices played. And that is critical to looking at all of the skills and letting those skills come to the forefront. It's sort of like park your ego at the door when you have these meetings, and realize that victims of trafficking have multiple needs too. So if you are used to just doing what you do best, so the NGOs are used to taking care of finding ways to address the needs of victim survivors, but there's a whole other need, the immigration needs, the legal, the criminal justice system. And so I think that we need to look through, you know, multiple lenses when we're approaching this. So we've got many people, many skills, and I think if you look at cases that are on record that are successful and have reached a successful end for both the survivor and for the criminal justice system, you will see that a multidisciplinary group was involved. Thanks, Liz.
Terry, you know, of course, Terry, you know, one of the things that I guess it begs the question is, do you run out and get one of these when you see those indicators, or is it better to have something in place to begin with? And how do you end up leveraging the relationships that you might already have?
Sorry,
Terry?
is that Flori? Or for Terry?
For Terry?
Terry, yes. I think it's so important, Lou, that we try to have those relationships in place already. The most difficult situation, whether it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking, is to try to make a cold call after a case is already hit. Now, oftentimes for maybe jurisdictions that have started primarily with sex trafficking cases, that's going to be the very kind of relationship. Who are the partners, the stakeholders that work those cases? They're likely going to be the same partners and stakeholders that would actually assist in kind of other multiple disciplinary teams, especially addressing labor trafficking. Very important that, we have both state, local, and federal law enforcement represented on these task forces. Victim service providers, critical as well. Flory mentioned the NGO world, the non-governmental organization world. That might be perhaps the newest frontier for our law enforcement to understand that these NGOs have really critical roles to play, especially when it comes to labor trafficking, that oftentimes it won't be law enforcement that will first identify a labor trafficking scheme. It will far more likely be a community member, a community organization, or a non-governmental organization. And they're so important for bringing those cases to law enforcement. Very importantly, too,
and sometimes, go ahead, I'm sorry, Terry.
Oh, yeah, that it's just a critical role. One of our federal prosecutors here in Florida was famous for saying that he never had a successful human trafficking conviction if there wasn't an NGO that he was working with. And that includes both really, really good, consistent victim and survivor care, but also even reporting these cases and then supporting victims as that prosecution and that legal case goes forward.
And sometimes the issues, especially around labor trafficking cases, often seem to indicate the need for immigration organizations to be involved. Megan, you've certainly seen that, I think, up in the Pacific Northwest, haven't you?
Yes. Hi, all. This is Megan. Many of my most robust and righteous cases that either went to conviction or where it didn't rise to the level of an indictment, we did our best. The victim survivor was either a visa overstay or undocumented and had a lot of threats of deportation and fear around law enforcement, of course, but where we're either a referral from victim advocates and or immigration attorneys. And the survivor was in need of continued presence, which my partner and I would apply for and they'd receive. And then they're working alongside their immigration attorney in a pursuit of a T visa while being stabilized with their advocate. And so over the years, my partner and I it was important for us to have like best practices around how to conduct our victim survivor interviews. And if the survivor wanted, we found it's really helpful to have the immigration attorney present during the interview and their advocate if they want. We also, most of my cases, I'd say 95% of them require also a court certified, if it's court certified, but definitely an interpreter, depending on the language. If it's an indigenous language, as we all know, it can't always be court certified. But kind of discussing like the role of everyone in the room and keep coming to the table and talking about what works well, how we can better serve the survivor, ensuring that their needs are met, but also definitely learned over time, if we're not collaborating with the immigration attorneys and that visa declaration, it needs to be in alignment with what the survivor's statements are, and it's much easier if we're all working together for the survivor.
Yeah, and Terry, since you practice as an immigration attorney,
Attorney-client privilege is very important, but it also comes down to then stabilizing a survivor, assisting them specifically with their immigration needs. Congress has created several immigration remedies, one called continued presence, which is something actually that a federal law enforcement or a federal agency applies for that victim. It's the immediate relief to simply kind of stabilize them. Very importantly, provide that survivor with a work authorization. I know one of the myths that we have out there is that, victims are powerless and victims are ultra vulnerable. Well, no, a great many of our survivor victims have actually come to the United States to work, and that work authorization that they then become eligible for by being willing to take part in a law enforcement human trafficking investigation is very, very important. So that's a key thing that an immigration attorney can assist in. Also then stabilizing that survivor, walking with them. The prosecutor really can't be the only attorney that that victim witness or that victim relates to, because the prosecutor has their own sort of professional duties to fulfill. The victim actually requires their own attorney, and oftentimes that immigration attorney can fulfill that need. Very importantly, too, the visa that's ultimately made available to victims that are willing to assist law enforcement and prosecutors. It's called a T visa, a trafficking visa, and very, very importantly, law enforcement does not apply for that. Federal prosecutors or, again, law enforcement do not ask for that. That's the provenance of the survivor or their immigration attorney. And why that turns out to be especially important, quite a few of our defense attorneys, one of the first questions they'll ask a victim witness on the stand is, what kind of benefits are you getting? Are you providing testimony because of what you're going to be given by the prosecutor or by law enforcement? And very important for a victim to be able to dispel any kind of quid pro quo. No, this is not something that a prosecutor does or something that law enforcement is doing for me. I have a separate attorney that might be helping me with that. But that's very, very important when it comes to our victim witnesses being on the stand, that they can legitimately say, no, they're not getting benefits in exchange for testimony. So those are the things that I think an immigration attorney can bring to both prosecutors and law enforcement. Also very important that we know our own boundaries, that we don't expect to be told everything about the case. We don't expect to be in on every interview. But again, as Megan mentions, it can help to have an immigration attorney there at the table, especially one that understands boundaries and that understands this is a part that we play, and that, again, we're one of a number of professionals that are actually a part of any kind of investigation and prosecution.
Well, and we've got on this particular slide, we not only have kind of the idea of the multidisciplinary approach, but we've listed out a number of those particular partners for them, or for you. And rather than go through each of those in detail, we hope that you've had enough time to look at this slide as far as who all of those are. I wanted to make a few quick points as well about some of the federal opportunities for assistance as well, some of the resources. Whether the teams involve folks from the Civil Rights Division, the local U.S. Attorney's Office, FBI, and ICE. The State Department's diplomatic security agents are especially active in labor cases, as are the Wage and Hour Division folks from the U.S. Department of Labor, as well as staff from their Solicitor's Office, Office of the Inspector General, Occupational Safety and Health, OSHA. All of these are great team members. And of course, speaking of the Civil Rights Division, their Human Trafficking Prosecutions Unit are the national experts, and they collaborate across the country on investigations and prosecutions. They're at the headquarters level, whereas the U.S. Attorney's offices, of course, are in the 94 judicial districts. Also at the headquarters level, you heard about Office of Victims of Crime, the TTAC, the Training and Technical Assistance, but also the Bureau of Justice Assistance, which has the enhanced collaborative model. All of these, I think, are excellent resources, not just for being on a case in and of itself, but as far as building that multidisciplinary approach. Each of the U.S. Attorney's offices have points of contact for the Civil Rights Program, as well as Trafficking Coordinator and Victim Witness Coordinators. And you heard at the top of the call about Assistant U.S. Attorney Mary Casera, who's the Civil Rights and Human Trafficking Program Manager at headquarters. And I think that that's somebody that we will make sure that you have her contact information towards the end of the call. I'm going to move now to the next slide on investigation strategies and interviewing. I think one of the things that, of course, we have to look at in all of this is that the investigation and then the prosecution itself are not really divisible. We have to be planning from the minute that we start what that case might look like when we go to trial, what that case might look like in a plea sitting, or what have you. And I wanted to ask Flory, as far as some victim interviews and how are some of the things that we should be thinking about when we're talking about victim interviews.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I think Megan mentioned it previously about the use of interpreters. The use of interpreters is a really critical need. And when I work with NGOs, I talk to them about if they have a program dedicated to working on human trafficking, that they should put a line item in their budget for interpreters. Law enforcement of different varieties have a responsibility in different situations to provide interpreters. We need to be careful that interpreters are not family members. They're not part of a trafficking case. Many of these labor cases involve groups of victims, and so you don't want to use someone from the group. You also don't want to have anyone in there that seems to cause alarm on the part of the victim. We've had some cases in New York that were derailed by interpreters from the same community kind of threatening the victims. Don't say this if they ask you this. Don't name names, blah, blah, blah. So it takes some screening and it takes some work. You have to ensure, if you can't get a court-certified interpreter, you have to ensure that there's some kind of confidentiality agreement. You could put people in great danger if interpreters were free to just talk about cases out in the community. It's also a good idea to brief the interpreter beforehand on some of the issues so that they can get comfortable with the vocabulary. And when there's been sexual assault used as a method of control, I have found that it's good to give a heads up to the interpreter. Some of them are not used to the kinds of stories that they will hear during these interviews. And then on the other end of the interview, it's good to debrief with the interpreter because they are not supposed to discuss what they heard, what they translated, etc. So you don't want them to leave with kind of an overflow of feelings about something. So I like to build that in. You know, when it comes to interviewing, that's what I teach courses on interviewing throughout the world because there are certain techniques that will elicit more information than others. If you go down the checklist for yes and no questions, you're not going to get information. If you develop a more narrative style of interviewing where you follow up on the response of the victim, you will get much more information. So it's a skill, and there are materials out there, and I urge anyone that's doing these interviews to really think carefully about how you're doing them in a sensitive way. These interviews are hard. No matter what kind of force, fraud, or coercion has been exercised by the trafficker, it's a difficult situation for an individual to have to repeat. We know.
I wonder.
Yeah.
I wonder, Flory, as far as when you, from an advocacy or a therapeutic level, or me, and Megan from the kind of the law enforcement prosecution, there's how the interview appears to us. But I wonder, as far as from Evelyn's perspective, how does an interview appear from the survivor's perspective?
as you know, as a survivor activist, and going back, thinking about my case, and trying to still stick to slide 6 and 7. I'm going to try to combine my answer. Just thinking back in my situation again, each victim's case might be different. Like for my case, you have to look at it. Like in my case, I came here as a child, and also coming from another country, and not only that, I also came into the country illegally. You know, and I didn't know at that time that I came to the country illegally. So each victim's need might be different, and it depends on the situation. It depends how they came here. I know Terry mentioned earlier about, you know, you have folks that come here with work permits, and sometimes it gets expired, and it's true like that. But depending on the situation, how would that need? I know that for me, in my situation, coming here as a child, my need was, for me, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't understand the situation, and there was just too many people, too many interviews. I wish it was done differently. I wish they had explained to me properly, you know, exactly what was going on. And I think you mentioned immigration lawyer. I think there was there was a very good collaboration when it comes to my case. You had the immigration lawyer, you had the prosecutor, and then you had people that also, NGOs, collaboration. And they really did work hand to hand to try to figure out my need, but they didn't ask me what my need would be. They didn't ask me, they just went by what they knew. So when when the victim is in that situation, I do agree with a lot of comments that you made, that all of you made. Try to find out what the victim need will be. And language barrier is always one of the biggest issues too. And try to know, you know, like Flo mentioned, who's going to be the interpreter, because they might be involved. And not only when my situation came out, my trafficker was looking for me, was trying to get in contact with me, and not only with me here, but also was getting in contact with my family members back home. So we really have to be careful and really work on what the victim's need is, and really ask the right question, and knowing the type of interview questions to ask when you're getting ready to prosecute a labor trafficking case, especially if they're from another country.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, one of the things, of course, is to try to take the experience of that person, especially, you know, if they're maybe unfamiliar with the U.S. legal system, or, you know, aren't necessarily using the magic words, saying I am a human trafficking victim, or I was a slavery victim, etc., and then translating that into kind of the four corners of the criminal code. And, you know, I think Terry and I, as law professors, could probably do an entire hour just on this slide, but I think it's probably more interesting to everyone if we take the next 10 or 12 minutes to go through some of the things for the trial stage. But I think, you know, these are typically a number of the charges that we would be looking towards when you're trying to build your case. And I urge everyone to be familiar with the code sections, whether it's in federal or state law. At the end of the day, again, we're talking about somebody who's using a scheme, plan, or pattern to make somebody feel that they have no reasonable alternative but to perform or remain in the service, and less serious harm to themselves or someone else might happen. And that could be psychological, structural, threats of immigration, referrals, etc. So again, this is kind of a list of a slide. And I wanted to maybe turn now to how you prove those things. Everything comes down to evidence at the end of the day. And, you know, Megan, you know, if you could maybe walk us through, how do you get to objective evidence with which to demonstrate the subjectiveness of somebody's will having been overborne through that type of coercive force? Megan?
Well, yeah. The being able to corroborate the victim's statement, survivor's statement, is absolutely essential. And as I kind of was discussing with you guys before, the
victim statement is truly kind of like the bread and butter of my labor trafficking investigations. And I really appreciated what Flory said earlier regarding like the briefing of interpreters. I think it's also essential. I spent a lot of time in the initial survivor interview really kind of explaining my role and the role of the advocate and the role of the immigration attorney directly to the survivor. I talk about the importance of taking breaks. I talk about the importance of them being comfortable with their interpreter. But I also am really straightforward about, I don't expect the survivor to all of a sudden feel comfortable with me, and I don't expect the survivor to think that they can advocate for themselves, but that's what I'm hoping to gain their trust over time and how important it is for us to be able to discuss their experience. And I found that to be really helpful, and it's I also discussed that it's not something that we're going to talk about everything that day. Because I found that these are really challenging, nuanced investigations where I have very little physical evidence. I maybe have a plane ticket that was, for instance, from Lima to Juarez. I maybe have a ledger. I maybe have a fake identification document that was procured for the survivor by the trafficker. But what I really need is those that really impacting survivor statement. And if there's possibly a witness that is willing to come forward that can corroborate, did anybody see anything? Can anyone, did anyone work alongside the survivor that would be willing to talk with me? And I really take my time to, like, if the survivor at the time isn't ready to talk about something, I'll go back to it. If there's no reason to kind of push, especially, you know, most of my interviews, the survivor is in the process of stabilization with an advocate. They're out of the situation, and although we're talking about safety concerns regarding possible retaliation by trafficker against like family members in home country, or concerns for retaliation to the survivor directly, still we have more time to be able to like take, schedule another interview later. If the interpreter is not working, use a different interpreter. The most important thing is for me to have a really robust interview with the survivor and be able to get those facts.
And so then when you have the survivor's account, what kind of corroboration then, as far as corroborative evidence, are you then looking for? You know, it seems like the lack of corroboration might be what keeps cases from being approved for prosecution, even if they might have been enough to warrant a T visa or continued presence or thinking of the person as a trafficking victim. But what kind of corroboration do you then look to, Megan?
Anything I can. You know, a majority of my cases, like I recently worked with a survivor that actually had a phone with several text messages and messages that were sent via Facebook and WhatsApp, and that was exceptional for me. It's really unusual. Most of the survivors I've worked with were not allowed to have a phone. So like I mentioned, like perhaps it's even maybe it's one threatening voice text that was sent after the survivor fled. Maybe it's an employment record where they were, maybe the victim survivor had been forced to work, let's say in a factory alongside their trafficker, and were able to find employment records that they were working there. Maybe it's an email that was sent with the plane ticket for the initial travel where they had to fly from one location to another and then cross via Coyote. Maybe it's various evidence of the recruitment, or I pretty much am trying for anything. Later we have been able to recover ledgers at times through our warrants. We've had the survivor describe exactly the ledgers that were used, where the trafficker had kind of tallied up the debt. We were able to find that thereafter. Sometimes there's an employment contract where, like I've had, it was not signed by the trafficker, but it had been completed by and given to the victim survivor, and then we were able to have that later.
Well, a lot of the different types of corroborative evidence are listed here on the slide. But one thing that I think is probably more unique to each particular case is shoring that up then and explaining a lot of those things up with expert witnesses. And Flori, you've done a lot in that area. Can you let us know what an expert witness can bring to somebody's case?
Sure. You know, as you're hearing, there's often not a lot of tangible evidence readily available for a prosecution, and there might not be witnesses, and there might not be even outcry witnesses who maybe didn't have any idea about what was going on but had some contact with this person. So when an expert is brought in, it's a great way to lay out the dynamics of human trafficking and testify as to the types of cases, what goes on, the power imbalance. Every judge and juror wants to know why they didn't leave, and the defense attorney will be all over that. So if you can head that off with an expert witness who can talk about the climate of fear and really dig deep into the dynamics between the employers and the workers. If the plaintiff's attorney has asked for specifics about this particular case, the expert can discuss the similarity between this case and other cases that are on record. Can also talk about how the victim is looking at the assessment of the situation in terms of what they, as individuals, bring to it, such as their education, their place of national origin, their cultural experiences. All this has a bearing on what has then happened to them when the trafficking occurs here in the United States. I have found that plaintiffs' attorneys are really grateful for this type of expert testimony, and when they do their homework and they do their prep and the expert knows his or her stuff and they work together, it can be very powerful because you can talk about nuances of trafficking that the prosecutor probably can't bring up. There's always that question of, well, they weren't held in chains and I don't see any overt physical abuse, et cetera. So the psychological impact of trafficking can be explained by an expert witness.
Excellent. You know, I think that, you know, again, we could do an entire webinar just on trial tactics and how to put together things, starting with expert witnesses, but throughout. But I also know that we've got about 3 minutes before we're going to lose some of you. We're going to be doing a Q&A after the 3 o'clock hour. But, you know, I wanted to maybe just tee us up on kind of where that prosecution should get done. And Terry, if you could take us on a 3-minute tour through kind of state, federal, what's being done and where do you think that this is all headed?
Sure, Lou. And, you know, this is, I think, one of the great questions, not just for this webinar, but for all of us in the anti-trafficking community in the United States. Historically, labor trafficking cases were almost exclusively prosecuted in federal courts, and a lot of that had to do with resources that oftentimes, and still does, require the resources that federal law enforcement can bring to an investigation. Some of it, though, had to do with the fact that for many years we just did not have state laws on either sex or labor trafficking. That has changed significantly now, and so very important that, again, our state prosecutors understand that there's new tools in their toolkits really just in the last 5 to 10 years, sometimes even more recently. A great case that came down in Minneapolis just this year. They had their first labor trafficking case prosecuted under state law, and it involved a local contractor. It was a construction contractor who was taking advantage of employees' federal immigration status or lack thereof. He'd also lied on his workers' compensation insurance papers to save himself some money. But interestingly, he pled out to labor trafficking under Minnesota law, also to insurance fraud. We really want to encourage our state prosecutors to look very, very closely at these new statutes that they have. Some very, very good ones in a host of different states now. Very importantly, too, that then gets the attention of state and local law enforcement. When they understand that, oh, this is something that can be prosecuted in their state courts, that puts it far more directly into their ballpark. And very importantly, not just labor trafficking statutes, but also things like unlicensed labor contracting, insurance fraud, failure to pay workers' comps. The recent religion case that came out of Chicago involved a woman prosecuted as a kind of a self-styled bishop. She exploited U.S. citizen women, typically in hotels, and drove some of them even to homelessness. But it was also wire theft that she was charged with. And a great new federal statute really just in about the last decade or so that allows us to go after fraud in foreign labor contracting, meaning that the fraud is committed in a different country. And we've seen cases where it's emails and phone records that can actually be used to prove that up, because it's all about what did that person promise and how did they fail to deliver. So I think the byword is really a variety, looking at a host of different things that can be charged. They include tax evasion as well, and realizing that, again, because trafficking is a segmented crime, it can be prosecuted for a whole host of different offenses.
So we've kind of, we're getting to the 3 o'clock hour, and we've kind of gotten ourselves to the point of charging the case in our tale of this investigation and prosecution. I think that my inclination is if we can continue for a couple of minutes on, we'll just assume that we've won at trial or on a guilty plea, and maybe talk about some of the back-end considerations, because whether it's restitution, whether it's sentencing issues, the role of victims in sentencing, they really, I think, flow into and flow from the relationships and the techniques that we were talking about at the beginning of the case. And I think that, once we do that, probably at about 3:10 or so, hopefully we'll be able to switch over to question and answers, and then take that the rest of the way over to 3:30 and then adjournment. But I guess that's one of the questions, Terry, that I have for you is, given the fact that you've mentioned fraud, whether it's fraud in foreign language recruitment, whether it's wire fraud, et cetera, you're often talking about a financial crime, and restitution is something that's part of the trafficking laws. What's your sense from, having researched this and studied it as a law professor and otherwise, as far as the restitution that's out there? I hear things from some of our counterparts in the advocacy community that they're concerned that even though it's mandatory restitution, that for some reason restitution is not being ordered.
And Lou, that's been a concern among those of us in the advocacy community, that under federal law, there's mandatory restitution, and that absolutely needs to be a part of every prosecution that we see, especially at the federal level. That's going to vary more state by state. Almost all states do have a restitution statute. Sometimes it's very limited. Florida, for instance, has been, to be honest, quite delinquent in actually providing remedies to our victims. We do not allow them a private right of action. We don't allow them the ability to sue or to seek punitive damages. And increasingly, I think probably close to 25 states do allow that. So very, very important, especially when it comes to taking down a trafficking ring. Oftentimes it's the low-hanging fruit that will get the criminal conviction, but you don't really get at that trafficking ring until you get their assets. So that the private right of action, the ability of a victim to sue, is increasingly important. Now, again, that's beyond the purview of a prosecutor, but it's certainly important for a prosecutor to understand, and that, of course, much of the record that will go into a criminal prosecution can then be cited to in a civil prosecution as well. Again, it varies state by state. Some states like Mississippi even allow for the dissolution of corporations that have actually been found to have actual knowledge of their involvement in trafficking, including labor trafficking. So again, some of that will vary still state by state, but very, very important, I think, for all of our prosecutors and our law enforcement to understand that private right of action, that ability to sue traffickers, increasingly important. And for those that are working with foreign national survivors, so important that a prosecutor or federal law enforcement be willing to sign off on that T visa. That is oftentimes the one means that survivor victim has of remaining in the country. It's interesting, in the 20 years or so of working with victims that I've done, their greatest concern in every single case has been their physical safety and that of their family members. It came before, employment, before lodging, before anything else. It was fear for their own safety and that of their family members. And that T visa is extremely important for then allowing them to remain here legally in the United States. It puts them on track for permanent residence and perhaps ultimately citizenship. But that role that our prosecutors and our federal law enforcement play in that, extremely important.
Well, it's been interesting to see the survivor advocacy that's grown out of that. When I was ambassador and I would look in other countries at the situation, and I'd say, well, how do you involve your survivors in what you're doing in your country? And they would look at me as though I was speaking a foreign language, because to them, survivors were somebody that needed to serve as a witness and leave and go home. So the idea that the United States now has such powerful survivor advocates who are here because of the T visa, who have become U.S. citizens, and really are colleagues and leaders here, I think that it has helped us immeasurably, not just to show that that's what we care about, but the human cost and the intellectual ideas that are brought to the table by the survivor community. I wanted to switch over on sentencing issues. We talked about restitution there for a second, but on sentencing issues beyond kind of what's the going rate. And I think that that's one of the things that I wanted to ask perhaps Evelyn first, and then Flory to follow up on the ability of victim witnesses to participate, especially at the sentencing phase, through victim impact statements to the court, whether it's letters in court, et cetera. What is the ability, the impact of the ability to be involved at that stage? What does that mean to folks? Evelyn?
Hello, yeah. To me, as a former victim, I would say it depends. Again, I'll go back, it depends on the victim, and it depends on their state of mind at that time, if they're already to be part of that interview, that, the court case and everything like that. Because a lot of the times when you just got out of the situation, you're not 100% ready, which I could say I was kind of, when it came to my case, I did like the collaboration and the fact that they prepared me to be ready for court. It is very important. I think it's very important for the victim to testify, but we also have to look at that before they testify to make sure that they are ready to be in the presence of the trafficker to share their experience, because depending on the situation, depending on how the trafficker treated them, they might not be fully 100% ready to be in that courtroom. But it is very important, and it's necessary to have them to do the interview. But we also have to work with them trauma-wise and just make sure they are ready to be in that courtroom.
Flory, what about, from your perspective, you've seen people both testifying in trial, through the kind of formal adversarial process. And then you've also seen people, whether it's by letters or in person, present to the judge at the sentencing phase. How do you look at all of those as far as the experience of the survivor?
Well, I think the testimony in court is really, really hard on the survivor. And hopefully he or she has been well prepped, not coached, but prepped and supported by advocates so that he or she can understand the process and get through it. But I think it's a great follow-up to be able to submit an impact statement, because the impact statement comes from the victim. It comes from his or her feelings. It comes from a place of going forward, moving forward. And no one's going to refute it on the spot, as the defense probably tried to refute their story on the stand. So I think if both can be done, it's very empowering and very impactful for everyone involved.
So I wanted to maybe end the presentation part of this before we go over to questions and answers by, again, kind of taking this as from the temporal exercise that we've done from identifying, seeing the indicators, identifying, interviewing, charging, deciding whether it's going to be state or federal, et cetera. We jumped to trial practice, and we assumed that we'd won. And hopefully we've gotten restitution, and our survivor has been able to come in and give a victim impact statement. But cases often are not over. And I guess I wanted to open it up to each of us to do a very, 30 seconds to a minute on this idea of cases never really being completed. Just because the sentencing happened, there might be defendants out there. When I was in the Civil Rights Division, we ended up doing a case that was 19 years old, and the person came back into the United States, and our indictment was waiting for them. That's something that I've certainly saw with my cases. How do you deal with cases where the relationships with the victim witnesses, or the potential for other defendants to show up means that it's not a take it into court, get done, and move on to the next file? Maybe if we can start with Megan, and then Perry, and then Flory, and Evelyn.
I would say that in some instances, I've continued to have contact with victim survivors where if we were unable to prove it didn't rise to the level, kind of like come back and get a hold of me if there was additional evidence or information. But moreover, I had a 4-defendant, 3-victim case that went to conviction, and we had a lot of issues surrounding, all the traffickers had 9 children between the 4 of them. And so there was a lot of, after several years, even in the last calendar year, we've had issues around the children in the foster care system and what's been going on with CPS and the lack of a lot of employment turnover over there, and how we've been able to communicate what happened with the cases. And one of our survivors had a child with one of the traffickers. There's a lot of stuff there. So really my involvement after a case has been more surrounding what's happening with retaliation attempts or issues surrounding the defendant's children, et cetera. Other than that, I think the real work continues with, I get updates on a positive level from immigration attorneys that I work with and advocates that a survivor received a T visa or is now a legal permanent resident. But that's something where, or sometimes I'll get emails from survivors wanting to let me know they've just received employment or become a nurse. But most of the time, I have boundaries set, and I just, if the survivor wants to get a hold of me and give me an update. So that's from my perspective.
Perry?
Right. And Lou, I think as speaking, maybe wearing my advocate or my immigration attorney's cap, yeah, so much of our work is just beginning after a case concludes, after a prosecution does, because then there's all the questions about the T visa, bringing in immediate family members that victim may have. We can't protect victims' families in other countries, but we do have very, very good new parole standards that allow us to bring in those immediate family members and then ultimately to extend the T visa to those surviving family members as well. But much of our work is just beginning at that point. I joke with my colleagues in law enforcement that they work with that victim for maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years while the case goes forward, whereas we have that survivor to work with for the next 20 years in terms of all the follow-up needs that they'll have. To be honest, that's one of the privileges of getting to work on the NGO side. We get to see people rebuild their lives, and that is a tremendous privilege for us. I've got to say, too, a great shout-out to our victim specialists, both in the FBI and also our U.S. Attorney's offices. They've been phenomenal for follow-up with a lot of our survivors, and that's really key because they've established really important relationships with those victim specialists, and they have that very, very important ongoing role. Just a final note, the victim specialists play a really key role in letting victims, survivor victims, know when our perpetrators actually release from prison. That's very, very important for our survivor witnesses and our victims to know for their own sense of safety, and knowing that someone will alert them to that, equally important.
Lori?
Yes, I'll make this very quick. I think that this whole notion presents great challenges to the NGO community because a victim will establish probably a very close relationship with their case manager or their NGO contact, and they would want to stay in touch. And there's an issue of professional boundaries, how long you can do that. And there's also a very realistic, horrible restriction on funding timelines. So some of the funding for NGOs says, okay, after 6 months, that's it. And nothing gets resolved in 6 months in these cases. So those are two big barriers. And I know that people work overtime and they try their best to stay in touch, but that's asking a lot of already overburdened frontline staff. So I think using some of the resources that have come up from other people is really good.
And I'll add to that, one of the things that I am always struck by, there's a case that I worked on over 20 years ago, and in fact, I see from the participant list that my co-counsel, who's now in AUSA out in San Diego, Chris Tenorio, was joining us. I hope he's still on the line. But, one of the things that struck me last year when I was in Florida for something is it's been more than 20 years now, and the relationship and, frankly, the needs between the local battered immigrant women's service provider attorneys there in Miami and some of the survivors from that case continue to be real and ongoing. Just because the case moved on doesn't mean that their lives moved on at the same rate. And it also doesn't mean that everybody in the case progressed at the same rate. Some of the folks were phenomenally good in being able to start a new life, and others not so much. And being able to be there for them throughout the process, I think, has been very tough because, as Flori mentioned, some of these funding streams don't necessarily support that kind of 20-year work with a client. But I'd like to close out by asking Evelyn to, before we get to Q&A, this notion of kind of cases that are over but they're not necessarily over. Evelyn, could you give us your perspective on kind of the long-standing and lasting effect of these cases?
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah. Am I closing up or I'm answering your question?
You're answering my question, and then I'm going to call for the questions and answers.
Okay. I would say for me, coming from a survivor community, I know that one of the most longest labor trafficking case usually involve around diplomats. You know, that usually takes longer to be closed out. And for me, you know, using my case as a case study, I mean, I would say that my case was a little bit, was not really that long, but it was. I think I would just say from my case was not long drag out, because again, when we had talked about having a weakness or having the victim writing a letter or being part of that, I would say that I did a good job when it came to prosecuting my case, because you know I worked with with every party that was involved in my case and answered every question that needed to be answered. And also, you know, it was great that they did travel all the way back to Cameroon to investigate my case, you know. So just, you know, depending, again, like I mentioned earlier, depending on the victim and their state of mind, if they work well with the investigator, the prosecutor, whoever is involved in that in that case, and they are willing to speak, it really helps the case to be a little bit, you know, to move quicker, not to draw all the way out. But it also really depends. But I do also, in closing, I would say I really feel like collaboration is really, really the key. And I did see a lot of collaboration when it came down for my case being prosecuted. There were, you know, all the different agencies, you know, work together. Yes, there were some that had to be removed, but once you remove certain people, the other did work very well together, which I think that made it kind of successful, you know, kind of made my case successful. And, you know, out there, the only difference I would say it was the restitution part, you know, that was really not really cleared out. But overall, I would say that having everyone work together helped my case to move faster.
And I'll end it with this, and that is that when I was ambassador at the State Department, we were able to have an event at the White House where Evelyn, not only you were there as a colleague and as a survivor advocate and leader, but we had a panel where the other panelist was Amy Pope, who had worked on your case as a prosecutor. And certainly for me, and I think for a lot of people in the room that day, to be able to see the two of you working as colleagues rather than necessarily as a prosecutor and quote-unquote her victim, that's a real strong message, I think, to a lot of people as to what these cases can look like in the long run. So thank you not only for your leadership on that, but thank you to Terry, Flory, and Megan for a great presentation. We've got about 10 minutes now for Q&A, and we've got a few questions that have come in. Before we do that, I'm going to just have this slide up for everybody so that you can get Mary and her colleague Brandy's contact information, as we had mentioned at the top of the webinar. But there are several chat submitted questions that came in, and I'll start, I think, with the most recent one, Aaron Blondell's question about what can we do proactively to identify labor trafficking situations when these cases are not arising in the normal course. I'm going to answer that extremely quickly and then toss that over, I think, to Megan. One of the things I think that we've seen in recent years is that because a lot of pre-existing child sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation of children efforts, such as the ICAC, such as Project Safe Childhood, et cetera, were kind of repurposed as human trafficking, that a lot of folks have looked for their trafficking cases to those same places, and in some ways, cases that would have been done as a CSAC or maybe under the Mann Act back in the old days are now being seen as human trafficking cases. I think one of the things that we see is that with the labor trafficking cases, it's the relationship with the non-governmental organizations and with the church and everyone else that makes it so that especially immigrant victims who are scared to come forward have someone who can actually pick up the phone and reach out to us. And so in some ways, it's not proactive the same way that posing as an underage prostitute or opening up a Backpage account and luring Johns in. Those are proactive techniques that are working in the sex trafficking arena. In some ways, the most proactive thing that I can think of in the labor trafficking is the relationship building towards a multidisciplinary approach. But Megan, would you like to address that at all?
Yeah, for sure. My relationship with and working with not only advocates but immigration attorneys has resulted in the referrals I receive have exponentially gone up in the last several years. But it's not just about a referral of something that I can't work. I've met with a number, let's say 35 immigration attorneys at different points, whether it be putting on a full training or meeting over a cup of coffee and talking about the difference between a wage and hour complaint or something that I would delve into, about statute of limitations and about how I conduct interviews and how I collaborate. So it's, and I've received a number of really great referrals. I also talk about because I work for Homeland Security Investigations as a task force officer, if a survivor's in the Seattle area, but all crimes were committed in another city, if that city, let's say Boston, was going to work it because the trafficker's still there, if they want to work the case, then I'll assist with a collateral interview. But it's also proactive and not just outreach with NGOs and immigration attorneys, but a fellow AUSA that kind of works on my cases right now, she and I had been conducting a lot of trainings for law enforcement and prosecutors, and a detective that was really savvy doing a sexual assault investigation in a small city within my county was looking for other witnesses to corroborate a sexual assault investigation that he was working. And that one of the witnesses ended up becoming our survivor victim one for the big case I mentioned already. It was the United States versus Sandoval, Mondragon et al. And he recognized as human trafficking, but he really hadn't worked a lot of cases and asked for us to assist and ended up becoming a huge case of ours. So it's kind of proactive in a different way, getting everything from a detective to immigration attorneys to advocates, spreading the word to then build potential cases.
Yeah, I think that if you don't keep pushing to recognize it as a labor trafficking case, a lot of these cases will very comfortably sit as wage hour or wage theft or just a bad work environment, and they aren't necessarily pounding on your. Glenn Parks asked, how do we balance the need to not be too duplicative and not have so many interviews, as Evelyn had mentioned, with the kind of sometimes you need to take it slow and come back for things. Flory is somebody who really specializes on how to walk that fine line. How do you not make it so that you're going back to the same well way too many times with a person who might still be in trauma?
Well, I can only answer to about half of that because I think the other half depends on the law enforcement interview. And I know that I've been told for the last 25 years by law enforcement, we have different timelines, and I understand that and I respect that. But I think this is why you have a team set up before a case hits, that you've been able to discuss these things and problem solve and come up with ways to minimize the repetitious interviewing. Whether you follow a child advocacy center model, which is you have everyone gathered in the same place and you're doing the initial interview. And if you're working hand in hand with an NGO who can consult about trauma and why people are not giving you all the information and why you need to slow down. I think my answer would be that you really need to have your teams in place so that you can discuss possible scenarios and how you might handle them. There's no good answer to this. There's no formula because everyone has their own need to get the information on a certain way in a certain time.
Thank you, Flori. So we've had two other questions. We've got about a minute left. Megan Tokash's question, which had a scenario, is maybe something that we can reach out, Megan, and we can talk through the scenario with you. So I'd like to tee up for Terry. Say goodbye for all of us.
Okay, sure. Well, you know, different kinds of retaliation that I think we're seeing just as an advocate. Number one of the things we really have to address is the threats of immigration retaliation. Quite a few of our foreign national survivors, especially in this sort of current kind of anti-immigrant environment in which we operate, traffickers are absolutely exploiting that. So that much more important that survivor be given an advocate. Where possible, too, it's good to see where local law enforcement is not being deputized to also serve functions as immigration agents. That tends to create entire swaths here in the country where, again, people are simply afraid to call in for fear that the local or state law enforcement officer will turn out to actually, be an ICE agent. So that's something that we're dealing with just at the base, at the community level here, especially here in Florida. Again, in general, though, about the retaliation, boy, safety is that very, very first thing for all of us, whether law enforcement or service providers, I think, to stress for our survivors, that is the first and foremost thing we want to bring to them.
Well, thank you, Terry, and thank you, everybody, for participating. We want to remind you that this was taped, and it will be available to you. I'm going to hand it over to our friends from IIR in case there are any final thoughts from their end.
Thank you so much.
This is Cameron. Oh.
Go ahead, Cameron. I was just going to say, on behalf of the COPS office, I'd like to thank all of our participants in this webinar. For those logged into Adobe Connect, the participant survey has been pushed to your device. Your experience and feedback are very important to us, and your input will help us measure the effectiveness of the webinar to meet your agency's goals and objectives. Sorry, I had a little technical issue there. But we hope the information shared will be of benefit to you in your efforts to enhance the prosecution of labor trafficking cases. And I really want to extend a special thanks to our speakers today for taking the extra time to share their knowledge and experiences. Thank you. This marks the end of today's webinar.